That lull in general volume in the room is maybe a signifier that we should kick off. So I'm hugely pleased to introduce Henry to those of you that haven't encountered him over the last 2 years, walking the halls as creative editor of Penguin Classics. It's been a massive pleasure, obviously, working with Henry and thinking about the Penguin Classics list in lots of interesting different ways, from an Aladdin's cave to a museum, and really delving deeply into that list, thinking about different opportunities. And a lot of that thinking has manifested itself in what is a really exciting project that Henry is going to talk to us about this afternoon. As well as being creative editor of Penguin Classics, Henry has recreated Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with a group of 23 pilgrims. He's written speeches for the government chief scientific advisor. He regularly hosts cheese tours of London, which sound delicious. He's scrubbed Hobbs on the set of MasterChef, which sounds less so.
How do you know all this?
He's authored 2 books, most recently obviously Follow This Thread, which was published last month, the month before now, and with co-author Matt Lloyd-Rose, Curiosity, which we're publishing in paperback imminently. I'm hugely excited to pass over to Henry, who will tell us both why we need the Penguin Classics book and how such a thing has come to be. So Henry Eliot, everybody.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone. It feels quite surreal standing up in front of you all here, so apologies if I start laughing or being weird. This is actually a very good place to talk about Penguin Classics, because the series began in a very similar location, at the top of a building, very near here, in fact, looking out over the skyline of London. But it began in the dark and the cold, with the ominous sound of Luftwaffe bombers approaching through the sky. And it began with a man called Emil Victor Roux, who would stand on the top of Birkbeck College, just up the road, during the Blitz, on the lookout for fires. As the bombs dropped, he would look to see when fires broke out, and then he'd alert the people, and there'd be a quick response to put them out. And he passed the time on these long, cold, dark nights by translating Homer's Odyssey. And he said, I returned to Homer in these unreal times because he was the supreme realist. And so he felt like Homer was keeping him grounded all the way through the Second World War. Anyway, every evening he would come down before he went out for his watching, and he'd read out passages of the Odyssey to his patient wife and daughters. And towards the end of the war, his wife said, maybe a bit fed up after years of hearing this stuff, she said, why don't you try and get this thing published? Send it to Alan Lane, which he did. And Alan Lane, in a kind of legendary and characteristically impulsive move, read 3 chapters of his translation and commissioned it on the spot. And not only that, he commissioned it, but he also asked this guy, Emil Victor Roux, to manage and edit a new series, a new Penguin series. Now, this is, I should say, against the advice of nearly the whole of his board at Penguin, because it was a very odd thing to do, really. Because between the 2 wars, there had been 8 new editions of the Odyssey come out, including 5 new translations, and none of them had sold well at all. Only 2 of them had sold more than 3,000 copies. Also, Emil Victor Roux was quite an odd character. He was a retired publisher of educational pamphlets. The only book he'd written before that point was this book called Cuckoo Calling from 1933, which weirdly has 2 penguins on the front. But so he wasn't an obvious choice to do this, and at the time, all classics, especially Greek and Roman classics, were the purview of academics, and this guy really wasn't one. So it was quite an odd choice, but it turned out to be inspired. The book was the best-selling Penguin book that Penguin had published. It sold over 3 million copies. It was the best-selling book Penguin had on its list until Lady Chatterley's Lover overtook it. And that was as a result of that trial. And E.V. Roux saw this series in its early sort of gestation and through into its career. The series has grown from strength to strength, as we all know, I think. It's had 4 different design looks. It's had lots of sort of sister series, many of which have now been subsumed into it, like the original Penguin English Library, the Penguin American Library, Penguin Poets, and so on. Penguin Modern Classics began as another sister series, but that remains independent. So it's kind of grown and grown and grown, and since the 1980s it has been the largest list of world literature in the world, and continues to be. And it is the only, I think I'm right in saying, it is the only branded series in Penguin Random House that is international. It's only one we do that is published all around the world. So it's quite an extraordinary series, and this book is, I guess it's intended as a kind of celebration of this series and as a companion for people approaching it. And I feel like there are three main audiences for this book, three ways of approaching it. I think the first is that if you open this book on any page, it is totally stunning. And that is really thanks to Matt, sitting at the back there. Matt has just done such an incredible job and also sort of overseen this feat of logistics to design this incredible book. So any page you open it on, it just looks beautiful. It's like, oh no, there's Evie Rue. I meant to show you that in a second. These pages are just beautiful. It's like sort of opening a huge box of really delicious chocolates and then gorging on them. They're just, you want to have these books, you want to touch them, you want to own them, you want to read them. So I think, I have a feeling, this is coming out in November, and I just think this should be the book that everyone gives everyone for Christmas. I know that my sister and I have this kind of annoying routine that we always give each other the same book accidentally at Christmas, because it always seems like there's that book which is the obvious one, and I feel like this would be that one. It's just obviously the book you want to buy for people. So I think the first audience is just people who want this stunning object. It's just beautiful. I think the second audience are people who are obsessed or in love with Penguin. Penguin. This is obviously a Penguin book, a Penguin Classics book, and the penguin-ness of it is very evident throughout. There's pages at the beginning about the history of the series. There's the Odyssey, the first cover, and lovely things like the original colour chart that was used for colour coding the first editions. And some of the key editors who've really shaped the list, like Betty Radice, who took over from Evie Rue, get their own little boxes throughout. But really the whole book is a kind of anatomy of Penguin Classics. It takes every single title that's in print now and shows how they first entered the list. And so by looking at the book, you're kind of putting your arms around the whole of Penguin Classics. And then I think the third, and really the audience that I'm sort of most enthused about, and the one I'm really sort of trying to talk to, is the audience of readers of all kinds. And I'm sort of imagining readers, every single kind of reader. So teenage readers who just beginning to sort of explore world literature and wanting to sort of spread their wings and fly through it, and this will hopefully show them some of the places they can go. I'm really hoping that students of literature will want to kind of see how their set texts fit into a wider picture and discover some other titles around them. And then I'm really hoping that readers who maybe haven't had a well-paved path into classics before, but would like to get into it, but maybe feel intimidated or off-put by, I don't know, the size of the classics list or by the reputation of it. I'm hoping this will be a kind of friendly and sort of easy way into discovering some of those great titles. In terms of what the book actually is, it's structured as a kind of history of world literature. It's got 4 main sections, which are marked with double spreads like this. So there's the ancient world, the Middle Ages, early modern Europe, and the industrial age. And then within each of those, there's a kind of geographical element to it. And Matt's done this totally brilliant thing of showing the spines of the first books in each section sort of running off the edge. So it's as if that's the bookshelf of the section kind of running off the page there. And then at the end, this hasn't been finished yet, but this is one of my favourite sections of the book, this sort of blacked out vaults section, which is going to be for titles which have been in Penguin Classics but have since gone out of print. And there are so many of those. We're not going to be able to include all of them, but hopefully there's a few pages of these, so it'll just be a lovely sort of smattering of these covers. And it's actually almost as interesting seeing what's gone out of print as what's remained in print. And the tone I've gone for throughout has been one of a kind of odd but friendly friend who's kind of taking you on a tour of their bookshelves and pointing out titles and saying, this is the title where that thing happens, or, oh, you should read this one because the author went mad just before writing that one, or you ought to read this one because there was this really odd film adaptation, and so on. So I've tried to find kind of engaging hooks for every book, and they're often quite odd and quite varied, and I hope, there's a slight sort of irreverence in there, but I hope it's like the Penguin logo, sort of flippant but also dignified. And I suppose the way I really want people to use this book, just to finish, is to kind of be inspired to read some of these books. And I should say at this point that I have certainly not read all the books in this book. I opened the introduction by pointing out that if you manage to find time to read 50 pages a day alongside the rest of your life, which I think is just about manageable, but probably quite tight. If you manage to do that, it would take you 27 years to read all the books in this volume. And there's a second volume coming out next year, which will be almost as long. So it's, I sort of realized quite quickly I wasn't going to be able to read all these. It weirdly hasn't been a problem because actually, as I say, it's very seldom that I really talk about the detail of what's inside a book. It's usually something to do with the context in which it was written, or something that's happened to it afterwards, or the sort of thing that people know about that book. Obviously, I have read some of them, quite a lot of them, and I sort of managed to sort of dig in. I held every copy, so I was able to sort of plunder them for tidbits and so on. But I'm hoping people will come away with a kind of reading list of what they want to read after going through this book. And I've certainly come away with a huge reading list of things I want to read urgently. And so I just thought I'd share, for interest, 7 of the titles that I'm keen to read after having written this book. I'll just go through quite quickly. This is another of E.V. Roux's translations, which he did after the Odyssey and the Iliad, The Voyage of the Argonautica, by Apollonius of Rhodes, who was the director of the Library of Alexandria at one point. And I'm keen to read this September, because I'm going on a sailing holiday in Greece, and I feel like that'll be the perfect moment to read that. This I can't wait to read, because it's totally bonkers. We know absolutely nothing about this person, Shiva Deza. The 25 Tales of the Genie is about a great king whose kingdom is threatened by an evil necromancer, and he's really struggling to know what to do. So he consults this genie who possesses the corpse of a hanging man in a gibbet on a tree, and this corpse sort of animates with the spirit of this genie and speaks to the king. And this corpse proceeds to tell 25 tales, and at the end of each tale is a riddle, and the king has to solve each riddle to hear the next tale, and if he gets through them all, the final tale will reveal how to beat the necromancer. I don't know what happens, I can't wait to find out. I keep mentioning this title, I still haven't read it, but I'm really excited to read Jacques the Fatalist, which just sounds totally up my street. It's inspired by Tristram Shandy, which is one of my favourite novels, and it's basically about a master and his servant, Jacques, travelling through France, talking about their sort of previous love lives, and they go off on crazy digressions and meet all these strange people along the way, and Diderot keeps sort of interrupting and so on. It sounds brilliant. I put this in partly because of that fantastic cover, but also because in here is this, what Poe described as a prose poem that I can't wait to read, called Eureka. Has anyone come across that? It's a prose poem. It's a sort of 40,000 word sort of description of the universe. It's a sort of cosmography based on zero scientific knowledge. It's just Poe just sort of thinking, what is the universe like? I'll write it down. And the little I've read, it just looks brilliant. And weirdly, he sort of actually has predicted some things which have come to seem true to science. So I'm quite intrigued by that. I feel very sort of ignorant of Russian literature, and I'm very keen to read more Turgenev. And I've never read Sketches from a Hunter's Album, which he felt was his greatest work. And apparently, you know, in Dead Souls, the whole issue is that there's serfdom in Russia. These dead souls are serfs who've died, but they are still being taxed. Anyway, apparently, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom after reading this book. So it's a very sort of influential book in that way. This I just love mainly because of the cover. I've never seen such a bleak image. But this is an example of just one of those brilliant books that we have in Penguin Classics. Nietzsche, of course, wrote in this very aphoristic style and developed his thinking on a number of sort of key themes over several volumes. And in this book, R.J. Hollingdale does a brilliant idea for a book. He takes those aphorisms and follows each theme through. So this book is sort of a replacement for reading the whole of Nietzsche, and it makes sense because Nietzsche writes in an aphoristic way anyway, so these quotations work perfectly. So this is a kind of quick shortcut for Nietzsche. And finally, I'm really intrigued by this book, The Damned by Huysmans, about a very sort of thinly disguised version of Huysmans himself, who's writing, this character is writing a book about a medieval baby-killing pirate. And to research it, he sort of starts to investigate the black magic scene in Paris at the end of the 19th century and gets drawn further and further in. It sounds really good. And with that, I'll finish and we can maybe do some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Henry. That was really excellent, a fantastic introduction to the book. And I think there are all kinds of amazing recommendations that you've given there that really give an indication of the sort of wealth of interesting stuff in this book that we're publishing in November. I'm going to hand over, and if anyone has any questions for Henry, now is the time to ask.
What's in volume 2?
Well, volume 1 runs all the way up to 1918, the end of the First World War, and it's publishing 2018. And the idea is that the second volume will come out 2019 and be the last 100 years. So it's sort of, and in some ways it's black classics and modern classics, although actually there's quite a sort of crossover. But there'll definitely be a sort of modern classics vibe to the second one.
When you were finding your kind of quirky bits of
Yes.
information, did you just find one and go, that's it, or did you have several and have to kind of choose between them? How did you do that?
Good question. Sometimes it was very quick, and I found it much harder when it was authors or books that I knew well, because I felt like there was so much that I wanted to get in there, and it was harder to see what was immediately grabbing. It really varied. Sometimes it seemed to go very easily, and I just find these things quite quickly. Some people's lives are just so bonkers, like Jan Potocki, that Polish guy who wrote, the Polish man wrote in French a book set in Spain called The Manuscript Found in Saragossa. And he is just brilliant. I mean, he traveled around the world. He was the first person to fly in Poland in an air balloon. At the end of his life, he believed he was a werewolf, so he committed suicide with a silver bullet that he fashioned himself from the knob on the top of his favourite sugar bowl. So, that's straight in the book. But, some people were a bit harder. But I just kept digging, found something. Yeah. Matt.
I was going to ask what the weirdest story you found. Any others?
Some of the ancient Greeks had some quite good stories, like Euripides. I didn't know this, but apparently he lived in a cave, and then, actually this isn't a very weird story, but he lived in a cave most of his life, and then he travelled just towards the end of his life to sort of see the world, and was almost immediately mauled to death by a pack of Molossian hounds, which was sad. And there's a story that, let me get this right, there's a story, I think, that Aeschylus, I may have got this wrong, but I think it was Aeschylus died from reciting one of his own lines from, no, that would be Sophocles. Anyway, some ancient Greek tragedian died reciting one of the lines from his own plays because it was overlong and he ran out of breath. So yeah, but this is sort of the kind of thing that's sort of peppered throughout it.
Is there anything quite like it, this sort of book of books? Is there a tradition that you're working?
Yes, good question. Well, there are sort of dictionaries of English literature. There's an American dictionary of literature, they're written very dryly, like reference books. Part of the brief for this was to treat it in quite an authored, I guess quite eccentric way, which I think I've done. And I don't think that does exist really. I'm hoping it will, I should have said also that there are links. The whole thing is a kind of web of links. So whenever someone has written about someone in the past, or is reacting to another work of literature, or where someone in the future has commented on something in the past, I've tried to always put that in with page references that send you off around the book. So I'm hoping it's just going to be like a kind of rabbit hole of connections, and I haven't really come across that before, I don't think.
And with the sort of treasure trove of detail, I kept wondering where you'd found this stuff.
Yeah.
Some of it's very obviously, stories from particular texts, but others, I wondered where you were.
Well, I always started with the biographical note in the volume itself and the blurb, and any other sort of information that was inside the book. And often, there have been some very funny previous and current colleagues of ours who have found these stories in the past. So often they'd sort of done the job for me. And otherwise, I basically amassed a sort of pile of these kind of books, these sort of dictionary books. And then if I still hadn't found anything at that point, I'd go digging in the internet and just sort of go down rabbit holes till I found something. So yeah, a real kind of mixture. But it was actually something I learned doing Curiosity, that there's always something, there's always some irresistible story, and it really was sometimes immediate and sometimes it just took time, but you just have to trust, I think, that you'll get to that silver sugar bowl in the end. Yeah.
How many books are in it?
Good question. Yes. So, it's actually quite a hard question to answer because there are, I think, Matt, you might know this better than me, but I think there's about 1,200 titles, but that refers to about 1,300 books, because often we have things in several volumes. We often have more than one translation or edition of things. But I think it's 1,200 and 1,300 are the sort of rough numbers. And the next volume will be slightly fewer. I think the equivalents will be 1,000 and 1,100, something like that. But we're looking at sort of roughly 2,500 books across the two. And there's something like 800 authors in this book. And there's a paragraph about every single one of those things. And I'm really feeling it at the moment because I'm working on the index, and it's just enormous. Yeah.
Did you notice any common qualities or experiences across the authors?
Oh, that's a great question. Really, the thing that sort of comes out of it, I think, is the way in which the series has kind of changed over time. I think there are some common denominators, which kind of comes into our commissioning of classics, which is, I think, all the titles in this book are of great literary quality, that they had some historical impact at the time they were written, and they have an enduring reputation of some kind. But it is fascinating to see how the list has grown and changed and evolved over time. And for instance, I know when Betty Radice came in, she was very keen to bring in a lot more Chinese literature, and suddenly you can see that sort of entering the list. E.V. Roux himself had I suppose after his Blitz experiences, had a massive prejudice against German literature. So there was almost no German literature in the list until Betty took over. And then the other way in which it changed quite massively was that during the 70s and into the 80s, there was a feeling that the audience for classics was becoming more academic. And up until that point, it had prided itself on being versions of these texts for the general reader, and very little apparatus and so on, just an introduction. And E.V. Roux really aimed to get novelists to write these things, like Robert Graves, Dorothy L. Sayers, Rex Warner and so on, rather than academics. But increasingly, especially in America, they were being used by students and in universities, so the sort of critical apparatus side started to be cranked up then. And I feel like possibly we're sort of coming out the other side of that now and feel like actually we can leave other editions to do that heavy apparatus, and we're kind of trying to present them as readers' copies a bit more again. But yes, I think the authors spread from, from Mesopotamia to Moscow and Morocco, and I mean it's sort of they're extremely diverse. But I think the common denominator is the quality of the works they've written.